Today is July 9th, 2017, and you're watching the For Real News, because the real news says they're for real, but we show you the real deal. One of the pet issues for the real news is, of course, the situation in the Middle East, and specifically the Israel-Palestine conflict. And they don't really make any bones about whose side they're on, which is fine. You know, everybody can have their own opinion. It's just, again, they're calling themselves the real news, meaning that they have to present both sides of the issue, which they don't really do it. Now, in this report, they apparently have a reporter who has an Israeli name, Shir Chaver, but you kind of see that they're skewed for a certain sort of narrative. So let's see if we can get some morsels of illumination out of their viewpoint.
Welcome to the Real News Network. The recent issue of Reality Check, an independent review of poverty reduction and development assistance, has dedicated itself to the topic of aid and militarism, especially in Asia. One of the articles in this journal is titled Militarism of Palestinian Aid, authored by Nora Lester-Murad and by Alaa Tartir. Alaa Tartir was on the Real News and discussed briefly the significance of international aid to the Palestinian economy. Let's have a look.
It's an economy that is stripped from its productive capacity, that is not able to create jobs, that is not able to sustain investments, that is not able to be self-reliant, and therefore has to be reliant on international aid and the donor community money. But it also means that it is an economy that is contained by the Israeli one. And the whole control structures and mechanisms that the Israeli occupation practice on the Palestinian people is reflected on the Palestinian economy. It's an economy that cannot export and import products as any other economy in the world. It's an economy that has no sovereignty whatsoever. It's an economy that does not have its own currency. It's an economy that lacks the policy space to become an independent, real economy without being completely controlled by the Israeli economy and by the Israeli policies.
Now let's discuss the security and military impact of this aid with one of the authors of the new report, Nora Lester-Murad. Dr. Nora Lester-Murad.
So before going to the main interviewee, let's discuss what he was saying. They were talking about how Palestine has an economy that's dependent and to a certain extent swallowed up by the Israeli economy, and how that undermines the sovereignty of Palestine as a country. Well, to be perfectly honest with you, Palestine has largely avoided many of the responsibilities of sovereign countries. They have refused several peace deals which would have granted it sovereignty, and they've never attempted to found their own currency. In fact, you can't go back into history and find a single Palestinian currency. They've always used either the Jordanian dinar or the Israeli shekel. So let's see exactly how they try to portray this whole aid crisis.
Murad is an activist and writer based in Jerusalem, Palestine. She co-founded Dalia Association, Palestine's community foundation.
So notice how he says Jerusalem, Palestine. First of all, he doesn't even say East Jerusalem, which is the only part of the city that the PLO even has claim to. He just says Jerusalem, Palestine. Well, technically these areas are under dispute. She doesn't live under Palestinian Authority control if she lives in Jerusalem. It's basically Israeli control. And that's just that's a subjective viewpoint that he's presenting there right away.
In order to promote self-determination and development, and as well as Aid Watch Palestine, to mobilize Palestinians to hold aid actors accountable, especially in the Gaza Strip. Murad writes about international aid, community philanthropy, and life under military occupation through her blog, The View from My Window in Palestine, and has published in The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Open Democracy, Mondoweiss, Huffington Post, Jadaliyya, and more. Thank you very much for joining us, Nora.
Thank you.
So the country which receives the most amount of aid in history has been the State of Israel. And most of this aid is military aid from the United States, The US is also giving some aid in a much smaller amount to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, and a portion of the aid to the Palestinians is.
So let's clarify this point. The Israeli aid from the United States, I'm actually opposed to foreign aid to any country. So I can agree that we should reduce military aid because it keeps these countries dependent on us, and in my opinion, they might as well just have their own foreign policies. Believe me, if the Israelis weren't receiving aid from the United States, their foreign policy would look much different, and this guy would probably be, red as a tomato can from rage.
Also, kind of security aid for things such as armored vehicles, firearms, and uniforms. How can the U.S. arm two sides of the conflict? Or would you say that the Israeli government and the Palestinian government really are two sides of the conflict?
Well, as we all know, the U.S. arms everybody. They arm the Saudis and the Qataris. They armed Iraq and Iran. So funding two sides of a conflict is not new policy for the United States. They do this because it's hugely profitable. Now, putting arms proliferation into the context of aid may confuse some people, making it appear that the U.S. is helping promote democracy and peace. But what it's really promoting is profit for the military-industrial complex. Military aid is not, as some think, cash that goes to allies so they can defend themselves. It's taxpayer money that's given almost directly in many cases to the U.S. military contractors. And what the foreign governments get is weapons and training that they use to promote U.S. military interests in their own regions. Now, in the case of Israel and the Palestinian Authority, just to answer your question more specifically, the U.S. sees the Palestinian Authority as Israel's partner in maintaining Israeli security, not their opponent.
So let's not parse words here. She just said that the U.S. maintains that is the case. Well, technically that is the case whether the U.S. maintains it or not. That's part of the agreement that was reached in the 1990s. This is the New York Times from February 11th, 1994. It says the new security agreement between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization calls for shared responsibility at border crossings into the occupied territories, with each side having its own station, police force, flag, and right to stop and search suspicious travelers. But a text of the accord made public by Israel today makes it clear that the Israelis will be the senior partner. They will have the final say on who may enter the territories when self-rule gets going there, starting in Jericho and the Gaza Strip. So this isn't new news. It's been this way for years. And let me point you to an important passage here that I highlighted earlier. It says, on the economic front, customs procedures and Palestinian access to overseas markets have yet to be defined. Similarly, important areas of civil authority remain unclear, including Palestinian broadcast rights, city planning, and water distribution. So, until there's a final status agreement and both sides have set out the parameters for all of those definitions, which include a lot of economic issues, then there's really nothing for her to say. This was an agreement by the two parties, the PLO and the Israelis. If they had such a problem with it, then they shouldn't have signed the agreement. I think what she's trying to say is that the PLO is not a legitimate arbiter, or not legitimate arbiter, but a legitimate negotiator on the Palestinian side. Well, more on that coming up. In the coming segment, Hefer and Murad try to make the case that the Palestinian Authority does not deserve military aid. Now, that's an ironic position for a couple of people, ostensibly journalists, that are claiming that they are working in the favor of the Palestinian people. But there are people that back that up. In fact, people on the other side that say that the Palestinian Authority actually supports terror. But listen to some of their reasoning on this point.
Well, we know that this rule has been violated multiple times and in many places of the world, but can you give us an example or several examples of human rights violation?
They're referring to a U.S. law that requires the Justice Department to withdraw aid to a country that has abused human rights,
which would have disqualified the Palestinian government for receiving military aid.
Yes, I can. Of course, it should also, the same Arms Export Control Act should also exclude Israel from receiving military aid. But when we're talking about the Palestinian Authority, it's absolutely true that there are increasing concerns by international sources like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, as well as local human rights organizations and defenders, that the Palestinian Authority is becoming increasingly oppressive. The extrajudicial killing of Abu Halawa in Nablus is one example.
What she's referring to is a person who last year murdered 2 Palestinian police officers and then got himself murdered by them. This is from the National in Abu Dhabi. It says Nablus, the second largest city in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, was gripped by violent protests on Tuesday after the death of a Palestinian detainee. Ahmed Halawa, the alleged ringleader in the killing of 2 Palestinian policemen last week, died in custody after being beaten by security forces, according to the governor of Nablus. So, you know, I'm not going to say that I endorse whatever happened, but it just doesn't surprise me that cops are going to beat the shit out of somebody who killed some of their people. And if you think that that's such a horrible crime, the real news, then you should probably change your policy on Syria, which does things that are far, far worse. Now, I'm not saying that you should be in favor of an intervention in Syria. I'm also against an intervention in Syria. I'm just saying that you should probably try a little consistency.
Rights organizations and defenders, that the Palestinian Authority is becoming increasingly oppressive. The extrajudicial killing of Abu Halawa in Nablus is one example, and there's evidence of arbitrary arrest and detention, torture and ill treatment, violations of freedom of expression and assembly. As far as I know, the PA is...
Sounds a lot like Venezuela, right? The real news. I mean, in Venezuela, they have all those things. They took over Global Vision. They threw Leopoldo Lopez into prison. He's just been released to house arrest. I mean, it sounds like Venezuela. Don't you think that this sounds a little like Venezuela?
Even using outdated Jordanian legislation to ban media critical of the PA, even arresting people for comments made on Facebook.
As explained in the earlier Times article that I featured, the Palestinian Authority doesn't really have laws on those things since they haven't been resolved by the negotiation process. So what are they supposed to do? Just make up the laws themselves? Well, they haven't yet. So that's kind of the fault of the Palestinian system.
But what's important to keep in mind is that these violations by the PA are being funded in part by international donors. Why would international donors?
So this is where she starts getting to the real point, that she doesn't like the way they're spending the money. But how does she want the money spent? Well, let's see.
Fund the PA despite these violations because they comply with Israeli wishes. So while the international community blames the PA, I think that's a bit disingenuous. The PA is essentially totally dependent on foreign funding and foreign political support. If they were doing something the US and Israel didn't like, for example, when they tried to use UN mechanisms to claim their rights, they would be made to stop it. And more, luckily, people like Diana Buttu and her brave New York Times opinion piece are speaking openly, saying that the PA does not represent them and should be closed. There have not been elections to legitimize their current mandate, and they're not accountable to the Palestinian people, only to Israel and donors. So
let's talk about whether they're really accountable to Israel. I mean, based on their own propaganda, the PA is not accountable to Israel. They claim that they represent the Palestinian people, but she raises a legitimate problem, which is that they haven't held an election, I think, in the Palestinian Authority since 2006. That makes it about 11 years now. I don't remember what month it was in, but one of the reasons it hasn't is because the Palestinian Authority is divided between the Gaza Strip, which is controlled by a renegade government led by Hamas, and the West Bank, which is run by the Fatah movement, which is the party of the ruling PLO.
So yeah,
Sorry, I think you're also making a point that I don't want to be missed here, that when you say international donors, you mean not just the United States, but also European Union, Arab countries, and so on.
Absolutely. I think the US and other international actors bear some direct and indirect responsibility for the violations of the PA by funding them directly, and maybe more importantly, by obstructing normal accountability processes that could enable the Palestinian population to keep the PA in line.
Now, one very important issue in your piece is about the militarization of aid to civil society. Civil society organizations in Palestine play a very important role in the Palestinian resistance and in informing.
So since when do civil society organizations play a role in a resistance? The traditional definition of resistance goes as follows. Okay, there are 4 real definitions to this. It says the refusal to accept or comply with something, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument. So that's a really general one. Could be, civil disobedience, for example. That's not really what happens over there. Then you have armed or violent opposition, getting a little warmer. Then a secret organization resisting authority, especially in an occupied country. Then you have a little more of an antiquated one, the underground movement formed in France during World War II to fight the German occupying forces and the Vichy government. And then you have the impeding, slowing, or stopping effect exerted by one material thing on another. That's in physics. So likely what he's really trying to say is the civil disobedience societies, but that's not really what is going on in the PA. Those organizations have never had real power under any of the governments, not under the Jordanians, not under the Israelis, not under the PA, because they really don't have a public to draw from. The people over there support either A, armed resistance, or they might be collaborating with the Israelis. I know from personal experience, I did serve in the Israeli army. I know that there's not really that much of a middle ground between any of those extremes.
And this includes organizations such as AidWatch, which you co-founded. So what do you mean that the aid to civil society organizations become militarized? In what way?
Well, several ways. One big and understudied factor is the role that U.S.-led anti-terrorism policy has played in distorting the availability of funding for civil society, not only in Palestine, but all over the world. First of all, organizations seen as philosophically or ideologically opposed to Israel and the U.S. don't get funded. They just don't.
So what's she complaining about? She wants foreign aid, which is coming from countries like the United States, but also, by the way, also from Israel, and also from other countries in the West. She wants it to go to movements that are against them. That's kind of like asking, I remember during the 2014 Gaza operation, that Mark Lamont Hill wanted the Israeli government not to have exclusive rights to the Iron Dome system, meaning that he wanted the U.S. to give it to the Palestinian Authority too. Meanwhile, ISIS has been developing kernels of support within the Gaza Strip. So, what exactly is the goal here? Equality doesn't really work when you have an adversarial relationship. You're not trying to get an equal footing in a conflict. You're trying to win.
And if there's a doubt about their political position, they won't be funded. And those who do receive funding are forced into what I consider to be dangerous contracts. They have to agree to enforce U.S. foreign policy on their own communities, becoming a kind of ideological police. They're forced to, or they're pushed to work outside of their mandates, ensuring that people the U.S. doesn't like are excluded from the benefits of their work, even when this internal policing promotes intra-communal conflict, undermines their own credibility in the community, or when it violates humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality. And I should also say the pressure is not only on Palestinian civil society, but also on international civil society organizations who often change the work they do, change the partners they work with, and change the regions they work in order to attempt to comply with U.S. restrictions.
Okay, so we're gonna go off of here, and that's it for the video. I will post the full video link in the description for this video. But what the fuck is she talking about? She wants the United States to aid organizations that are against the United States. Now, let's also talk about one of the reasons that aid is so controversial here. Why there's groups that the United States does not want to give aid to, or there's reasons why they don't want to give aid at all to the Palestinian Authority. This is from July 1st, 2016 by Eli Lake from Bloomberg View. It says the Palestinian Incentive Program for Killing Jews. And it talks about a whole program, it says, where Palestinian offenders who have, stabbed or killed terrorists and been killed themselves or been thrown in prison, they're given basically monthly stipends by the Palestinian Authority. It says whoever said crime doesn't pay hasn't talked to the family of a Palestinian terrorist. For the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the related Palestinian Authority, the killers of Jewish Israelis are considered martyrs, and as such, their families are paid for the service these murderers have done for the Palestinian cause. This has come to light this week after a Palestinian, Mohammed Tarera, stabbed Hallel Yafa Ariel, a 13-year-old Israeli girl, as she was sleeping in her bed. The stabbing was part of a wave of attacks by Palestinians who have for nearly 8 months been shooting, stabbing, and running down Jews with the encouragement of social media and popular songs. According to the latest report of the Russian, European, U.S., and UN group known as the Quartet, there have been 250 of these kinds of attacks since October. It says these terrorist attacks, which have been carried out mostly by young, unaffiliated individuals, contribute to the sense among Israelis of living under constant threat. Then it goes through a few people. It quotes Commentary, which is a magazine that I think is a little skewed to the right. A lot of skewed to the right. For years, the Israelis and the Palestinians didn't do much on this issue. The Israeli Defense Forces worked closely with Palestinian security services to keep the peace in the West Bank. Meanwhile, the Bush and Obama administrations have pressed both sides to restart negotiations over a final status. This is starting to change. On Friday, this was last year, remember, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he would begin withholding part of the tax revenue that Israel sends to the Palestinian Authority, equal to the amount paid to martyrs. Then it talks about how Frank Lowenstein, the U.S. Special Envoy for Israel-Palestine negotiations, told the reporter that the U.S. has recently started withholding funding for the same reason. We have robustly complied with legislation passed in 2014 that requires us to deduct from development assistance to the Palestinian Authority for Palestinian payments to individuals imprisoned for acts of terrorism, he said. The amount of development assistance that has been withheld is classified. So that's one issue where we're seeing just this. She's not talking about that. For all she cares, they haven't done shit to get punished. Well, as long as the checks are getting cut by the Israeli government or the American government or even European governments that don't want it to go to terror, then why should they give money to organizations that are, or to people that have committed these acts? I'll give you another example. Okay, this is from Reuters, January 4th of this year. It says Israel sentences Palestinian UN worker for aiding Hamas in a plea deal. An Israeli court sentenced the Palestinian UN worker for 7 months in jail on Wednesday for that's only 7 months, by the way, for aiding the militant group Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the United Nations agency that employed him said. Wahid Abdallah al-Bursh was detained in July and said by Israel's Shin Bet security agency to have confessed to being recruited by the Islamist group in 2014. Under the terms of a plea deal, Bursh is expected to be released next week, the United Nations Development Program said. A Shin Bet statement, it's actually not pronounced as Shin Bet, I think it's called the Shabak, but it said in August, said Bursh had provided assistance in the building of a maritime jetty for Gaza's dominant Islamic group using UNDP resources. It also said Bush had persuaded his UNDP superiors to prioritize the neighborhoods of Hamas operatives, where earmarking money for construction in Gaza, which was when earmarking money for Gaza, which was devastated by a 2014 war with Israel. The aid organization said in a statement on Wednesday that the court's decision confirms that there was no wrongdoing by UNDP. UNDP has zero tolerance for wrongdoing in its program and is committed to their highest standards of transparency and accountability. Shortly before Bush's detention, Israel also indicted a senior Palestinian staffer with the U.S.-based charity World Vision on charges of funneling millions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza. A foreign ministry spokesman said the trial of Mohammed al-Halabi was still ongoing. Hamas had denied any links with Bush and rejected the charges against Halabi. Hamas has observed the de facto ceasefire with Israel since 2014, when 2,100 Palestinians and 73 Israelis were killed in a war, but Israel blames the group responsible for all rockets launched from the territory. So there you have it. We're not going to get an agreement on anything. Obviously, the Real News doesn't know who I am, but maybe that will change one day. But you can't get away with asking for aid. I can understand opposing policies of the Israelis or supporting the Palestinian cause. In my opinion, you can support any side you want. I mean, you kind of do have to make the case, but you have the right to do it. But can you ask a country that is an adversary to send funding to groups that are opposed to them? That is downright idiotic. I don't know who these people think they are, but the Real News has to start thinking about aid in a realistic manner. I think that we have to start talking about weaning all of these countries off of foreign aid, and then we can really talk about them being sovereign for real.